Malcolm Langford from University of Oslo, who will give us a keynote, and then I will take the floor for the others' participation.
I have to stand like that behind a prison wall here. I can't dance around. I have to constrain me. Okay, I've got to talk into this, I guess, as well. Okay. In 2009, I was here presenting, like many of you, my plans for my PhD project. And Dan Brinks, who commented on it, said, "You seem to be advancing a grand theory of social rights adjudication, of what judges should be doing." Like all PhD projects, it became a little less ambitious over time, dealing with issues of legitimacy and effectiveness. But over the years and different other projects, it's matured into a book that I hope is going to be coming out next year, which more concerns a theory of how judges should think about their role in difficult cases like social rights, but also climate change, and to a certain extent things like AI and other emerging technologies. This is now a 14-minute presentation of a very large project, but let's go. So firstly, complex legal problems. What are they? So let's think about the types of cases we sometimes might be discussing here. How many litres of free water must be provided as part of a human right to water? 10, 15, 25, 50, lots of different standards. This was a big issue in cases like Mazabuku in South Africa, which really perplexed all levels of the judicial system. Or should a request for oil extraction licence by Shell or someone be denied because of the effects of climate change, like many courts, including the Norwegian Supreme Court, have been grappling with? Or should AI models be largely prohibited in public administration because of current concerns about accuracy and bias? When we think about hard cases in law, to use Ronald Dworkin's term from his 1970 lecture, the classical idea is you have two reasonable interpretations of the same legal provision or precedent, and it's difficult to decide between them. But we can divide that further and talk about controversial cases that essentially deal with moral problems that are essentially binary in nature. Is there a right to demand abortion or not? You can't really choose something in between, and it's often a type of problem in which judges or experts don't necessarily have more expertise. A classical moral binary type problem. And then you have what I want to focus on is complex problems. They're often defined very simply in legal jurisprudence and scholarship, when there's lots of scientific stuff and lots of facts. But I want to draw on complexity theory from particularly the social sciences and natural sciences and how we think about this. And define them in three ways. So a complex legal problem has high cognitive load. Okay? It often is diverse spatially with lots of elements. Okay? In a legal case, it might be actors, facts, laws, jurisdictions, and so forth. Also for when it comes at the political level. There's a great interdependence between the elements in the problem. Okay, if I can't isolate the problem necessarily, because if I address this thing over here, that will have consequences over here. Everything is interconnected. And then it tends to be dynamic over time. The nature of the problem is changing while I'm thinking about it. So trying to regulate AI at the moment, when we're getting new AI models and developments every day, how do you actually do it? Often complex problems are nested in complex adaptive systems, partly of which we discussed in the last panel. Social systems, natural systems, legal systems, which are all having these dimensions. They're interconnected, they're moving, and you're trying to solve something in this jungle of complexity. And then we have acceleration, that things are moving faster and faster and faster on almost every indicator, as Alvin Toffler showed in his 1965 book, and has continued to happen, future shock. So it's difficult when you get a problem like this to actually think it all through. Psychology shows we can only hold 6 to 7 ideas or thoughts or points, elements in our brains at any one point in time. It's difficult. The second characteristic of a complex legal problem is epistemic uncertainty. Perhaps we don't know all of these elements that are there, or to the extent which they all play out. But we also get problems of emergence. We get self-organizing properties within complex problems and systems where things work together and create new effects that we hadn't even thought about, okay? And we know that, for example, we've learnt that with climate change or traffic systems. Things can develop in new ways, just like with evolution. And that means we often end up in complex cases with 4 types of epistemic uncertainty. Legal, what is the actual law going in here? We might have multiple jurisdictions, interpretation. Factually, can we nail down AI or climate change? Subsumptive, how do we apply the law to the facts? How much water should people be getting? And remedial, what types of remedies will actually be effective rather than just symbolic in such cases? And we have first order effects, but also second order effects, which lawyers are not trained to think about, for example, beyond second order effects within the legal system. And then to make it all worse, most decision makers struggle with polytelicity, that you have different objectives, okay? If you and your friend are going out to see a movie and your goal is just to have fun, okay, then it's a question of which movie is most going to enable us to have fun. But if you both want to have fun and have a talk at the same time, then you've got 2 goals. And like in many legal cases and many complex legal problems, we might want to have effectiveness and fairness. And that makes it difficult when confronting these sorts of cases. So as was said by the judge in the climate change case in Pakistan, climate change has moved from the debate from a linear local environmental issue to a more complex global problem. In the context of climate change, the identity of the polluter is not clearly ascertainable and by and large falls outside the national jurisdiction. Who is to be penalised and who is to be restrained? Can courts help with these cases? Do they have the competence and the legitimacy to deal with this, or should they really be left to the executive and legislature, as some would argue? Courts, from a competence perspective, have some epistemic advantages. They deal with concrete cases. They're partly protected from political pressure. They have to give reasons, unlike politicians. But they also have epistemic limitations. The jurisdiction of a court is limited legally or physically. I mean, judges in a German climate change case actually took planes, ironically, to Peru to try to work out the effects of what was happening there, for example, with climate pollution from companies. Temporality, a court must respond to it with a judgment relatively quickly, even if it's a long problem where the effects are not known for 5, 10, 40 years. And the forum, not all the relevant actors are there, and judges may not have the requisite skills. And then there's a classic legitimacy issue, which we've been talking about with Roberto Gogorella and others for many years. Yes, courts can provide accountability and perhaps better deliberation, but they can struggle with democratic and sociological legitimacies. So courts can maybe help here, but there can be issues about representative democracy, participatory democracy, deliberative democracy. Climate change cases are very much taken, for example, by middle-class groups. Health rights cases in some Latin American countries also have dominance of middle class. So we get concerns here from a democratic perspective, but also sociological legitimacy. How will all these actors react? Will these decisions undermine the authority of the court generally and specifically? Will there be compliance and impact? So in thinking about this, I set up a framework and saying, what do we expect courts to do? And say basically 4 things. We want them to be independent. We want them to enable meaningful participation, people can be heard. Them to give reasons in a determined way, but also come up with effective remedies. 4 different goals, polytelicity. And when we think about approaches, and this is when we're going to get to transformative constitutionalism by the end, there's a posture that a judge takes, there's the techniques that they apply, and there's the overall philosophy. What I argue is that we have 3 standard approaches that we end up in complex cases. We have the traditional formalism. This is too difficult for courts. It's policy. We don't have the competence. We make off. Okay, like when a tiger approaches you, we have 3 biological reactions. Okay, you can flee, you can freeze, or you can fight. Okay, so this one's you flee. Okay, a legal institutionalist approach. And it's very much concerned about participation. Or you have deference, which is basically to freeze, manage the problem, Okay, maybe some parts which are justiciable, we find some standards that we can use. The rest, yeah, we don't deal with. What we can reason through, a la Lon Fuller. It often leads to incremental constitutional ideas, which Cass Sunstein, Jeff King and others have argued for. Then we have vigilance, which is very much fight. Courts can do this. We can make states accountable. We find standards. We've got the Paris Agreement. We've got the WHO standards for water. Judges can do this. This is transformative constitutionalism. South Africa put all these rights in the Bill of, we've got this great court. It's smart. We can work it out. We can make it happen. The Indian courts, well, even more, we'll just do it. I'm not even going to tell you why we do it. We just give you an order and off you go and do it. There might be some virtues in courts adopting consistently one of these three approaches. It might be contextually appropriate. Maybe in Norway, a very much deferential or formalistic position is appropriate. It might be empirically justifiable, responding to the epistemic and sociological conditions, or normatively defensive, appropriate given these conditions. But there are a lot of vices in this standardism. It risks being very reactive. And under strong conditions of uncertainty, epistemic, judges may be vulnerable to hot cognition, bias and occasion noise. Anyone who's been to the Indian Supreme Court with everybody screaming, trying to get heard, might experience that very profoundly. But also cold cognition, reliance on inappropriate legal and human heuristics, something that Veron has been working a lot on, which are, shortcuts, simplified rules of prudence for navigating uncertainty. And it's not just human heuristics, but basically we have a lot of legal heuristics, presumptions, doctrines, procedures, remedial practices, which we quickly fall into. But the problem with sort of fast and fragile heuristics, which can help us in many circumstances, can also amplify epistemic mistakes. And as some neuroscientists are showing, we get sort of, for example, invisible smartphone syndrome, where we think our smartphone is ringing because we're used to it in certain contexts. And actually it's not. And I sort of call this invisible doctrine syndrome. We just think that it's appropriate now. And neuroscientists are basically saying that this is amplified by a very much sort of left hemisphere dominance in the way we address new problems and creativity, that we often consume by, strategic, goal-oriented thinking, which puts things into parts. And we neglect the right hemisphere in terms of how it approaches problems is often creativity, looking at things holistically to get a better sense of how things fit together. And that takes time to get that sense. A bit like when you go to the shower, for example, or go for a walk in nature or meditate. Suddenly a new idea comes. My proposal, this is the third part, is adaptive judging, with three elements. The first is mindful review, moving from reactivity to a more responsive approach. So if you look at judges talk about mindfulness in different ways, and when they push themselves back to say, let's be mindful of different ideas in this case. We also have non-legal traditions of being mindful. For example, I like the way that Batchelor, in sort of his work on secular Buddhism, it's about the cultivating the ability to be responsive rather than reactive to life's unfolding. Or Keats, capable of being in uncertainties or frictions, like we heard from anthropology in the last session, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, to sit with the uncertainty and the difficulty, the friction of a case, and see what comes. And then balancing your integrity, for example, as a court, with openness to new ways of doing things. So I think this requires, in terms of a judicial posture, an attitude developing awareness of a case's complexity and uncertainty, being open to the parties' claims and alternatives, probing the consequence of a decision or remedy, like Justice Ruth Gator Binstad did in, for example, the first same-sex marriage case. Do you really want us to do this, given the reactions of Roe and Wade? Think through the second-order political effects of us making this decision. Displaying sensitivity to the accuracy versus effort trade-off in resolving uncertainties. How much effort should the court put in? And being open to new spaces for adaptation and learning. This approach tends to, in my view, balance the four common expectations of courts a bit better. Expands the ability of the courts to be more spatially, relationally, and temporally responsive. The second thing is, moving from posture to techniques. Sometimes it might be using your standard formalistic, deferential, or vigilant approach, or being more, or varying, but choosing one of them, a different one than usual, or being orthogonal, thinking about more experimental, reflexive techniques. And in the book, I go through 4, a more dialogical approach, you know, maybe with weaker remedies or spaces for more dialogue between the parties. Experimental review, okay, where you focus less on making a definitive determination of remedies, but you call parties back, for example, once a year to discuss which orders might be appropriate in reaching the goal that you want through a particular order. Network review, in which you establish, which is usually in standard governance, but I think courts, the European Court of Human Rights, is increasingly doing this, and I think its climate change judgment does this. Basically gets domestic courts, parliaments, and executives to work as a network to move forward new jurisprudence and approaches on climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so, just to keep this moving, obviously just to give an example, experimental review, it can be done at the procedural stage, like South Africa, meaningful engagement in negotiations, additional experts and actors. At the substantive stage, flexibility in the standards of review, but also remedies, responsibly deferring some parts of the order to see if the courts and the executive can solve this together. A rolling regime of orders, or blackjacking. So the first proper social rights case, New Jersey Supreme Court, 1973, Robinson versus Cahill. Basically, the court said, we don't know what the right amount of school financing is, so we're just going to say equal financing for all children in this state. That order comes into effect in 9 months. If you come up with a better idea, New Jersey State, come and tell us and we'll change the order. Okay. The IDP case in Colombia is perhaps the most famous example of, you know, over 10, 20 years, calling all the actors back every year to deal with one of the most complex cases we've seen. 6 million people internally displaced, pretty much every constitutional right found to be violated, but only 3 orders. You know, increase the budget, develop indicators, and meet back every year to tell us what you're going to do. Finally, final point, the judicial philosophy. We've seen a debate between transformative constitutionalism coming out of South Africa, India, Latin America, and also other countries, even in the German context, versus more incremental approaches. Formally, we can talk about preservative, transitional, transformative, and restorative constitutionalism. I want to argue for the idea of transformative incrementalism, which comes out of complex systems theory and historical institutionalism. Empirically, we're seeing that the constitutions that seem to make the most impact are those constitutions which don't have revolutionary changes that can adapt over time, with courts who intervene in critical junctures to move something forward dramatically, but then embed it. And the work of Miller Vistag and Chilton, particularly around constitutions here, is quite important. My argument is we might want to think of courts as co-architects and co-gardeners in the process of constitutional change and transformation of society, working with executives on maybe big picture developments, but also the small details, embedding things in practice if we're serious about social change. How this looks can be really different. Sometimes, the court might, in a critical juncture, make a move, but then be willing to adjust it, like the New Jersey Supreme Court, adapt over time. It might be to wait and move. Okay, we're not sure if we have the competence, legitimacy, like the Supreme Court did in the first same-sex marriage case. It waited, and then it moved when public opinion caught up. The other is to sort of shape and bake, a bit like the European Court of Human Rights has done in the climate change case. Shape the overall framework, but don't fill out the details too much. And then it's slowly baked over time with different actors. Or maybe it's an incremental approach, steady as you go, but it's intentional, okay? And I think these sorts of techniques would help, for example, going back to the Mazabuco case, which was a deferential case where the court said, we can't decide how much water you need. We'll let the government decide. Whereas other countries like the Germans and the Colombian constitutional courts have said, we don't know either, but we want you to come back and have a dialogue about how we do it best. And there's some weaknesses, of course. I thought that was my last slide. But self-critique, can you actually do it? Courts may be perceived as more political, engaging in this. Can courts be so dexterous? Can judges do this? And does it lead to personalism, that some judges become domineering personalities in this way. Now, thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm, for this very interesting and amazing speech. I would like to call the participants of this panel: Andrew Newman from University of Bergen, Jaina Katari, Center for Law Policy Research, Bangalore, Tatu Mazian Goako, University of the Wits, and Varun Gauri, please. So, Andrew, you have 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you for your talk, Malcolm, and thank you, Siri, for having us all here. So just a bit of brief background about where I'm coming from with what I'm going to say here is that my background is in political philosophy, and I've been working a bit in indigenous rights here at the University of Bergen. And I wanted to, my brief little tie-in to this presentation is that quote from Keynes. And I just want to make the point that it is indeed very hard to get rid of the old ideas. And as a result, it's important to know our history regarding the genealogy of the law. And just a little example from my own life recently, I was visiting my cousin in Amsterdam, and I realized I was walking down Hugo de Grootstraat in Amsterdam, named after Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius, who his job, he was employed by the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, basically. His job was that whenever a Dutch ship came back with something that they shouldn't have, that he had to legitimize why they had it. So he was one of the founders of international law, and you can still see a lot of the ideas he came up with back in the day, seeping into things like UNCLOS and a lot of work in just war theory. But so he had this very novel idea that property rights should be given to non-Christian, non-white people, because the VOC could then purchase things legitimately from these people. So, because it was always this balancing battle of coming back to the Netherlands, and they're people of dignity, and they have to legitimize everything they do, and we have to realize how today that courts still are legitimizing colonial actions, not in exactly the same ways, but in slightly different ways, legitimizing dispossession in new and novel ways all the time. So, additionally, we should be aware of language in the courts. So European and European-inspired courts have a specific language around property, resources, sovereignty that is deeply rooted in a specific epistemology. And courts need to be critically reflective on the epistemological basis of the laws that they administer, and find new ways to open up to different epistemologies and integrate them into the ways that they judge. So engage with indigenous peoples to come up with a common language and attempt to decolonize the language that we use in these courts. Words like resources can be quite problematic. Talking about natural resources around somebody's home, can be an issue. It's treating your land, the land that you're tied to, as a means is not always the best way to go about things. And that also to realize that not all relationships to land and territory need to fit into familiar boxes. This came up in the earlier discussion. Like, if you talk to people from the Torres Strait Islanders, what their territory is, it wouldn't end at the beach. It would extend into the reef. It would go for a little while offshore, but even though the Australian government recognizes that they own and can govern the land, as soon as you hit the water, that is Australian water. Mm-hmm. So they have no control over what happens there, are not able to exercise their self-determination to the fullest extent once you leave the land. Which puts, for an environmental spin, like you see sea nomadic peoples in Southeast Asia struggling to bring their issues around water pollution to the correct court because they're not under the jurisdiction of any specific country, and they're not in a territory. They're at sea. So we need to rethink our courts in a way that accommodates different relationships to territory. And also recognize that not every sovereignty claim needs to take the shape of a secession claim. So when the Inuit want some degree of autonomy in Canada, there are options for nested sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, that doesn't take the same shape as what the Catalonian people might want. They want to set up a similar state to Spain with similar institutions, and this can be quite different, but we have to be able to negotiate the terms of nested sovereignty on a level playing field. So that is all I will say for now.
Thank you very much, Andrew. You are on time.
I saw you pick up the phone and I was like, I'm really close.
So please, Jaina.
Yeah, thank you.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again, Siri, Lara, all of you for inviting me to the Bergen Exchanges. Thank you, Malcolm, for a fabulous presentation and keynote. I want to just respond to many of the issues you raised by giving the example of a current case going on in India. Indian courts and judges, like you rightly pointed out, are experts at giving large-scale, solutions to complex problems without and then we have to deal with the fallout of those decisions. And one case that I want to give as an example is the Elephant Corridor case. This arose out of an area in Tamil Nadu in the Nilgiris mountain area, where in 2010 the government declared a large tract of land to be an elephant corridor, which is supposed to be a traditional pathway or a passageway for elephants. In fact, in 2010, when this was declared to be an elephant corridor, this was actually the result of a public interest litigation that was filed by some activists in the Madras High Court, saying that the government should declare something as an elephant corridor. So in 2010, the elephant corridor was demarcated. This notification was challenged in the Madras High Court, mainly by private landowners and by resort owners, because they were already operating in that region of the elephant corridor. The Madras High Court upheld the corridor identification and said that all private landowners and resorts had to vacate, and they within 3 months. But the court held that forest dwellers and traditional indigenous communities could continue remaining there. This was then challenged by the resort owners in the Supreme Court. During the proceedings in the Supreme Court asks the district collector to take action and to file an action taken report. So the district collector seals a large number of properties which are claimed to be commercial resorts, and gives that report to the Supreme Court saying that I have already sealed these properties, and they were physically sealed and closed. Then out of these properties, some were resorts, some were just private properties, private landowners. In 2020, the Supreme Court lays down this large landmark judgment on the elephant corridor. It's a reported decision where the Supreme Court said that the elephant corridor has to be protected. This is a migratory route for elephants, and that all commercial resorts have to be completely closed within this elephant corridor. But because there were a lot of objections by people who said, well, even our properties are sealed despite not being commercial resorts, or there was some dispute as to exactly what should be the extent of this elephant corridor, the Supreme Court set up a 3-member committee and said that, well, all of you who have problems go to this 3-member inquiry committee. Post that, the inquiry committee hears individual cases. While hearing individual cases, the inquiry committee says, well, all these property transactions in the elephant corridor are actually illegal because these are forests, and actually nullifies property registrations within the Elephant Corridor. All these aggrieved people come back to the High Court, the Madras High Court, and so, you know, the litigation is just going on, mushroomed into a whole range of complex problems. You know, some of the issues that came up were that resorts stated that we've been operating here prior to 2010, when there was no whiff of an elephant corridor. Private landowners says, well, you've nullified our land registrations. What happens? Who does the land go to? Does the land go back to the state? Does the state have the right to assume that land? The courts, the Madras High Court, which, you know, there's a bench of 2 judges who are extremely proactive and very much, you know, adhering to, you know, they belong to the Nilgiris area, so they are extremely emotional about it and are telling the government, well, why don't you just acquire all this land so that we have no problems? And in the bargain, I mean, you know, some of the complex issues that I see, which you raised, one is that great complexity because you have different stakeholders, you have, you know, commercial resort owners, you have private landowners, you have forest dwellers, traditional communities living there, scheduled tribes. You have government using land there. There are public schools, there are primary healthcare centers, all in the Elephant Corridor. And how are all these different, you know, property holdings going to be decided? Second, there's a complex web of legislation. You have the Forest Conservation Act, you have Wildlife Protection Act, you have local Tamil Nadu Private Forests Act. I mean, you know, there are at least 5 or 6 different legislations that are applying on it, and the court has to grapple with all of that. We also have a Supreme Court ruling in the 90s in the Godavarman case, which I'm sure you're aware of, where the Supreme Court said that we are not limiting forests to what is declared as forest. We look at the dictionary use of what is a forest. And so therefore this was used by the court to say, well, we don't care whether it's Elephant Corridor or not, it is a forest area. And you can't operate or use forest area. And next, is there meaningful participation? I mean, the only people in the litigation right now are the resort owners and the private landowners, and not the native or the forest dwellers or traditional communities living there or the tribal groups living there. They are nowhere in the litigation. The court is trying to protect their rights, but their voices or their views are not part of the litigation. So that is an important you know, vacuum in this litigation. 30 seconds. Yes, and finally, all of this is being done by the court for environmental protection. And therefore, the questions that come up is that what is the capacity of the court? What is the basis on which the court is doing this? Are there, you know, who is representing the, you know, whether you call it scientific information or the expertise on what should be declared as an elephant corridor, how it should be regulated, should it be completely, you know, there should be no use of the land at all. So these are complex questions, and we're seeing all of the issues you laid out, courts and parties grappling with it. Thank you.
Talu, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you, but mostly thank you to the organizers, Anna, Lara, and Siri for having us. I will just be sharing some reflections from a recently published book chapter which looks at our work in informal settlements with a social movement that we work with at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute. Some of you may be aware of Abahlali Basemjondolo, and Malcolm's written quite a bit about them as well. But the chapter is entitled Here to Stay, Using Legal Strategies to Claim Rights in Informal Settlements in South Africa. And what we argue, as Malcolm already found in his earlier chapter that I was rereading, was that in order to really render the litigation meaningful, a lot more needs to be done outside of the courts, and that legal strategies alone are not adequate, specifically to transform the property system, which is what is needed in the South African context. And so informal settlements, represent a range of issues, both historical dispossession, urbanization trends, which result in several people's moving into cities over time, but also, a lack of affordable, well-located housing, which results in informal settlement residents having to spend between 34 and 55% of very little income on transport just to get around. And so what the case studies that we look at in the chapter are cases that range quite early on in Abahlali's history to much recent cases. And we look at three that reflect how their use of the law has changed, but also how the state's responses to the litigation has also changed, including an escalation in violence. Basically, I just want to get to it. The three cases that we look at in the chapter include the slums challenge of 2009, which was really important for stopping, at the time, the eThekwini municipality from basically being able to carry out like wholesale evictions through a piece of policy that they were trying to introduce in the lead up to the 2010 FIFA World Cup. And then there's the Nzimela/Zulu cases, also went to the Constitutional Court, but resulted in a 2014 judgment that basically ordered municipalities to stop using interdicts as a way of instituting backdoor evictions, as they put it. And then finally, there's the Ekenana commune, which was a branch of Abahlali, and I say was because a part of the issue with Ekenana was it was on the receiving end of like extreme violence, in addition to efforts to evict the community through the courts. But that culminated in the assassination of 3 leaders in 2022 alone. And so what these cases show is that Abahlali's successful use of the law is important in how they are able to use the law, so mobilizing the law as an important tool in affirming the rights of informal settlement residents, rights to housing, basic services, and other things. But what has been important is that they've been able to use their successful litigation as a mobilizing strategy, which has helped them to grow the movement to over 150,000 members today, with settlements across the country, in mainly for provinces finding a home in the movement, and giving expression to what Abahlali calls living politics, a way of acting and using mobilization and organizing to advocate for the dignity and rights of informal settlement residents. But as I said, litigation is not enough. And what happens is often successful litigation often fails to provide the necessary protection on the grounds, particularly in contexts where violence escalates following successful litigation. And another thing is that while losing in court, the state has continued to espouse an ahistorical position on land, which is that while their losses in the court have been able to secure meaningful policy developments, so one of them, which actually date back to Grootboom, the informal settlements upgrading program, the state has acknowledged that instead of informal settlement eradication, they would upgrade informal settlements in situ. But implementation has been mixed. In fact, it's been quite poor, and I think we're yet to see an informal settlement that is fully upgraded with full community participation, which is an issue in and of itself, because on the one hand, the state doesn't seem to really understand the policy as it's been drafted, but also, state officials have struggled with moving from RDPs, so is that time? No? So greenfield development, which is basically top structure housing, which is much easier. That's been the human settlement approach to housing delivery, towards brownfield development, which places an emphasis on infrastructure before providing top structure housing. But in our engagements with the state, you know, there is a lack of understanding about the policy, as I've said, but there's also like deep-seated opinions about informal settlement residents, which continue to play out in a range of ways, one of which I think, you know, end of July, the city of Johannesburg mayor led a raid on an informal settlement, speaking about how, you know, they need to demonstrate to the residents of Johannesburg that they don't allow lawlessness. And you see this posturing, basically bringing together a politicking that speaks to the propertied and wealthy residents of Johannesburg at the expense of informal settlement residents, but also a departure from policy that the city claims to be developing in terms of informal settlement upgrading. And a 5 seconds. Yes. Well, yeah, so I apologize for not explaining a number of terms. There's only so much you can do in 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be up here with all of you and to be at the exchanges. Thanks for the presentation, Malcolm. So I guess Dan said you wanted to do a grand theory of judging. I think I'm going to say what I hear is an industrial psychology of judging. Kind of how do the mindset and attitudinal stances of judges interact with their work environment, you know, including their doctrinal theories, which is part of their environment. In complex cases in particular. And I have many thoughts on experimental review and dialogic review, and I've written about it, but I think for purposes now, I think my main value added might be to talk about the psychology of the behavioral economics. Yeah. So one of the main challenges for judges and for everyone really is confirmation bias, right? Daniel Kahneman says it's sort of really the fundamental problem, overconfidence confirmation bias for decision-making altogether. And it's kind of wired into us, from evolutionary psychologists argue, because when we are overconfident, it's easier to deceive other people, right? If you think about this in terms of even just like deterrence, you know, like if you think you might attack the rival party, you want to convince them you might, so that they, you know, are afraid of you. But the best way to appear crazy is to be crazy, you know, sort of like, you know, and so it's sort of like wired into us in a pretty profound way. And now add judging, right? If you're wearing a gown and a wig and you're sitting about 20 feet above everybody else, that's a recipe for overconfidence, right? And confirmation bias. So it's going to be pretty hard to overcome, and you hear it a little bit like Indian judges can be overconfident now and again, I think. So how do you manage that? And I think that's one of the questions you have, and I think it's very, very hard, you know. Another main challenge is loss aversion, because you need to sort of like let go of your old doctrines and be open to something new. And loss aversion is also wired very deeply into us. So what do we do about that? One of the most well-known papers on judging and behavioral economics is from Danziger et al. In 2011. You probably know this paper. It was about Israeli judges. The question was, do they let people out on bail? And the researchers tried to look at all these characteristics of the case, the litigant, whatever. The main determinant of whether a judge said yes, you know, let him out, was whether they just had a coffee break, right? So at the beginning of a session, the release rate was 65%. Right before a coffee break, it went down to 0, right? And so what's going on there? What's happening is that the default decision is, you know, like, no, I'm not gonna let him out too risky, When they have energy, they're thinking, okay, I might be able to let him out. But when they're like getting hungry, and you know, right before a break, they're like, I'm exhausted, I can't deal, just no, right? That's what's happening. The study, you know, there are some questions about the ordering of the cases that's sort of back and forth, but I think it sort of holds up. There's other work on hunger and decision making too. One paper looks at Ramadan, you know, and not on default, you know, whether hunger leads you to make default decisions, but on pro-social behavior, which is a little sort of related. the finding there is that, when you're fasting during Ramadan, you actually are more pro-social, even though you're hungry. But other kind of fasting leads you to be less pro-social. I've done some work with Jean Dessetti and others, and we look at kids, and hunger leads kids to share less food, right? But to share other kinds of things. Anyway, so I think it sort of holds up, more or less, even though there's some questions. This is broadly in line with the work on scarcity, right? Sanda Malanathan, Aldar Shafir, Amandi Mani, they do a lot of work looking at when you are short of time, short of sleep, short of money, and suddenly you sort of you fall back. You don't have the same kind of bandwidth to make good decisions. The most striking finding there is on Indian sugarcane farmers. The same sugarcane farmers, when they're worried about money, they're sort of like money scarce, their IQ is 10 points lower. The same than when they're not, concerned about money. 10 IQ points is about one night's sleep. So if I kept you up all night and gave you an IQ test, it would drop about 10 points. So it's a lot, right? And there's a lot of findings in this. So one of the main ways, I think, from behavioral economic psychology to help judges deal with complex cases is to add bandwidth. It's like all these cases are exhausting, overwhelming, deadlines, timing. Let's add bandwidth, whether that's in AI, through AI, maybe, or default rules or something like that. So that's, if you're thinking about the industrial psychology, adding bandwidth might be maybe the most important thing, rather than attacking confirmation bias directly, which is very hard, or tackling loss aversion directly, which is also very hard. Mindfulness. So I'm a big believer in mindfulness. It's part of my life. The research on mindfulness shows that mindfulness can lead to more empathy, and more pro-social behavior. However, it may not be so good at overcoming confirmation bias and some of these other kinds of things, right? So the one paper that I think it's on students, like mention these papers, there's this whole term out there called, like on psychology, called weird. It's sort of, most psychology papers are on weird people, which is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, We don't have enough papers on the rest of the world, but anyway, it's a weird sample. But the finding is that if I can sort of like have you do a little mindfulness exercise and then measure what happens on these biases, and what they find is that is not correlated with reduction in bias, However, in the psych jargon, trait mindfulness, this is like, if it's part of who you are, like if you're a long-term mindfulness practitioner, that does seem to eliminate bias. But of course, that could be correlated with some other attribute that leads you to choose mindfulness as part of your life, right? So it's sort of a little unclear on that. A few seconds? Okay. And so the last thing I'll say, not wearing my researcher hat, but my old sort of like practitioner World Bank hat, is what about scale? If you're how are you going to take this to scale? Sort of like we can do some exercises, do things in one place, but if you're doing an intervention, how do you bring it to all judges or many judges or a whole country or something like that? But it's super interesting. Thanks for the paper.
Thank you. It's amazing panel. We have some minutes for questions on the ground.
So, my head at once. So firstly, let's start with transformation. Like if we want to actually transform societies through rights, I think Abashlali Basmondolo is a fantastic example of a social movement that thinks about law in a careful way and very careful about when it goes to courts and when it doesn't. And I remember interviewing them years ago, asking, well, have you considered this? Yeah, we have, but for this reason, we're not going to the court on this. But this, we think we can get a catalytic effect. And I think that's simple. I think many litigation movements can learn from them, also Treatment Action Campaign, about when and where courts can be effective, and having civil society ready to also work on compliance and impact afterwards. So yeah, courts are just part of the picture. In terms of strategic behaviour theory, in some ways I'm reflecting, say, rational choice theory, and recognising that courts do have actually goals that they're operating according to. But it's ultimately a normative argument rather than an empirical argument, because I'm saying courts need to be more aware of all the goals that they're actually operating for, because a lot of the time courts are doing it unconsciously. So I'm trying to bring the unconscious goals to the surface and say, let's reflect on those. Sometimes you actually say, I'm not going to be strategic as a judge, I'm going to be very legal institutionalist here. But other times, actually think about, for example, impact or backlash. Yes, this may be legally correct, but you could undermine the power of the court long term here. So getting judges, I think, to think through the types of goals that they're engaging with. Varun raises some really important points around the psychology here. And both on the hot cognition and the cold cognition. Just on what helps judges address confirmation bias. There is research on complex problems that, for example, if a group is just interrupted by something else and then goes back to the complex problem, they do better than a group that just focuses on that problem the whole time. So you interrupt your brain a bit, but you give other parts of your brain a bit of time, perhaps deeper parts to reflect on it, maybe right hemisphere, these sorts of effects. And so in that sense, something like mindfulness or whatever it might be in way different forms can operate as also an interruption effect, like when we go and have a shower and suddenly get a new idea. And one of my judicial heroes, even though I'm sort of against judicial heroes, is Justice Kingham in the climate change case in the Land and Environment Court in Queensland. Because what these cases concern are basically extraction licenses for fossil fuels. And throughout the world, companies have been raising the drug dealer defense, which is basically, okay, if you stop this coal mine, well, somebody else is just going to come along and produce coal, okay? If you take this drug dealer off the street, another drug dealer is going to come on. But some economists in the USA say, well, does this actually work from an economics perspective? And then she's like, well, prove it to me. The first judge to say, get them to, and there's 250 pages of modelling evidence, going back to uses of more data-based and AI-based approaches, which showed that the South Asian market for coal in the 2040s would actually not be so affected by taking this coal mine out of the picture. So she really, you see, and she maintains a neutral stance. She engages with the economics. She visits the indigenous communities and the children's communities who took this case. And I met someone who knew her, and I said, like, what is it about this? Because it's an incredible judgment that takes seriously all these arguments, works through the complexity, and in the end says, on human rights grounds, no. And she said, this woman, she walks with her dogs every morning for like an hour. And I thought, so, that's a way, I think, of perhaps creating space. But I think the point is, how can we deal with our confirmation biases? And there may be different ways for different people in doing that. And that goes to both Varun and Tom's question at the end, which there's the final chapter is, could we transform the judiciary in this respect? I think it can happen in different ways. So this book is on one hand for judges, but it's also for lawyers. Because lawyers frame cases. They give judges the options, the types of remedies that they propose in particular, how this case could be solved. They are the sort of the drivers of sociological imagination. And that's why I think, for example, the climate change litigation movement needs to learn quickly and drastically from the social rights lessons, from the complex civil rights cases, before we get case decisions that are rejected too quickly or won't have impact. But I think it's also about institutional design. How to, maybe in some areas slow down a case or get more collective decision making. I think the way that the Supreme Court of India is organised is a good example perhaps of not how you would do it, but other courts are too restrictive. So I think there are institutional design lessons here as well, and also judicial education implications for all these judicial academies, which tend to be very focused on substantive law, rather than, as you said, the industrial psychology of being a judge. In medicine, you learn, for example, the technique of motivational interviewing, reflective listening. How to convince someone who doesn't want to vaccinate their children not to do it. You're trained in reflective listening, how to bring about change in that sense. We don't train lawyers in deep psychological techniques on self-understanding, but also the psychology of the actors that they're dealing with.
Thank you, Malcolm. We have to finish because we are on time. So I invite everyone to talk during the coffee break.